Hello. So this podcast is centered around FARSCAPE, as the title suggests, and why FARSCAPE is my vote for the best sci-fi television show of all time. So if you don't know what FARSCAPE is, well, I won't try to judge you. I will try not to judge you too harshly. But it's kind of like, how do you not know what FARSCAPE is if you're a sci-fi fantasy fan? But with that being said, there are a multitude of sci-fi shows that I'm pretty sure I've either never heard of or I've never seen before. So maybe it's just, flown over your radar, but if it has, then I will do my best to try to recap really quickly for you guys. Actually, I'm going to do a really quick introduction that I found on Wikipedia of what FARSCAPE is. It does a really good job of just kind of summarizing the show better than I would, because I'll probably spend half the podcast just going over each season. So if you don't know what FARSCAPE is, really quick, it is a sci-fi show that premiered in 1999. It was an Australian sci-fi show that the Sci-Fi Channel picked up. I think actually the Sci-Fi Channel picked it up in 1999. I don't know exactly when it first premiered in Australia. But anyway, it goes, FARSCAPE features a diverse ensemble of characters who are initially escaping from corrupt authorities in the form of a militaristic organization called the Peacekeepers. The protagonists live inside a large biomechanical ship called Moya, which is a living entity. In the first episode, they are joined by the main character, John Crichton, a modern-day American astronaut who accidentally flies into a wormhole near Earth during an experimental spaceflight. On the same day, another stranger is picked up by Moya, a peacekeeper named Aaron Soon. Despite his best intentions, Crichton makes enemies, the primary one being Scorpius. There are a few standalone plots, but the show gradually unfolds progressive story arcs, beginning with their recapture by the Peacekeepers, followed by Crichton's search to find another wormhole back to Earth, and eventual arms race for wormhole technology weapons. Secondary arcs explore the way in which the characters change due to their influences, adventures together, most notably Crichton, his obsession with wormhole technology, and his relationship with Aaron, and the neuron clone of Scorpius in his brain that haunts him. So that's a quick synopsis of FARSCAPE. Again, if you've never heard of it, maybe you can check it out. It is still one of, I think most people would consider it one of the best. I consider it the best sci-fi TV show that I've ever seen. And here's why. So for me, the brilliance in FARSCAPE is first and foremost the characters. I don't think FARSCAPE would be the show that it is. And I think sometimes people don't give enough credit to how the characters of a show make a show or show anything, show, movie, play, I don't care what it is. The characters are the foundation of what makes any storytelling great. A book, the reason why books are so popular and people love reading books still to this day so much is because of the characters. A book can be, and people say it all the time, books are, usually better than their adaptations, is because when you get into like visual adaptation, so much of the focus becomes the visual, and sometimes the characters tend to lack because of that. And I think at the end of the day, when you have great characters, I don't care what's going on around you, because the characters are great and the stories are great. With that being said, it's not like the visual lacks in FARSCAPE, but the first and foremost amazing thing, or the thing that makes that show so amazing, is the characters. I think the first time I saw FARSCAPE, just a little back history about my relationship with FARSCAPE, was in 2004, 2005. Which was after the series had already ended. And I didn't get familiar with FARSCAPE until the Peacekeeper Wars. So the Peacekeeper Wars was a mini series. Basically, it was I think it was like 2 episodes only. So it was like a mini series. It was like 2 episodes, and it was basically a movie. Mini series are basically a movie that's just kind of split up into 2 sequels that premiere on TV. So it's basically considered a mini-series. I consider it a movie that kind of wrapped up the entire story of FARSCAPE. And Again, I didn't see that until after the cancellation of the show. The show was originally meant to run for 5 seasons on the Sci-Fi Channel because the Sci-Fi Channel picked it up in, I think, 99. And then it ran for 4 seasons, and they canceled it after the 4th season. And to give the fans what they wanted, they wrapped it up with the miniseries, which I thought the miniseries was amazing. I literally knew nothing about this show before watching the Peacekeeper Wars, and absolutely fell in love with it. Absolutely fell in love with the characters. My favorite character was Rigel. If you know, you know, right? He's the puppet character on the show. And I think even still to this day on, like, if you Google it, it has a 92% like, even on Rotten Tomatoes, I think it's like 60%, but IMDb is like 8 out of 10. And IMG is a little bit weird, but it's like a 92% people who watch the show liked it. It's amazing, to be quite honest with you. And another reason why the show is amazing, and this is just me particular, I think if you go online communities and hear people talk about the show, we all pretty much fans of the show have a pretty solid consensus of why we loved it. But the one specific reason that I love the show, and it's a personal pet peeve of mine, actually, which I'll get into a little bit of a rant because it is a pet peeve of mine, is that the show FARSCAPE is a sci-fi show that's actually a sci-fi show. And so, kind of to deviate just slightly, one of my bigger pet peeves in the sci-fi community is that there's a show out there that is a good show, and I love the show just like everybody else, but maybe not the same as everyone else, that consistently gets rated the best sci-fi series of all time. And it's because their community of fans is so large. But it is a pet peeve of mine. That kind of is seriously a pet peeve of mine, is because the show is essentially not a sci-fi show. And I think some people already know where I'm going with this. And it's going to ruffle some feathers. But the fact of the matter is, Firefly is not a sci-fi show. And the fact that it consistently gets, voted as the best sci-fi show of all time is a bit irritating to me because it's so far from a sci-fi show. So, and what ends up happening is, because the space is so small for like fantasy, sci-fi, comic book stuff, a lot of times those things kind of get grouped together when it's a little bit outside of a specific category. And Firefly is a space odyssey show. It's a space odyssey show. It's a space fantasy show. It's all of that, but it is not a science fiction show. And then it was like this weird sort of distinction being made between sci-fi, that was spelled SCI/FI, and sci-fi SYFI, which is the new sci-fi. Their spelling of it is sci-fi SYFY now, because there has been some distinction made because of this sort of grouping everything together, even shows that have no science in it whatsoever, as being more fantasy, space fantasy. And so that's sci-fi with the Y as opposed to sci-fi with the I, because it doesn't really have any, science in it at all. I don't really make that distinction. If it's considered a sci-fi show in my book, then I really expect to see science, theoretical science in some areas of the show. Firefly never had that, was never that show. And so for me, like the closest thing you'll get to science in Firefly is the spaceships that they travel in, which you don't hear them talk about the science behind the spaceships. It's just very common knowledge that people, spaceships in Firefly, that world is as common as, cars are in this world, so it's very common. It's not, really talked about. It's not something to explore the science of. So, spaceships in Firefly will be as scientific as cars are here. So it's not science fiction. I like the show. Not trying to ruffle any Firefly fans, because that is a huge community and they are enthusiastic about that show. And even after all these years, they are loud in the community. So, not trying to piss anyone off, not trying to ruffle any feathers, but the fact of the matter is, it's not a science fiction show. FARSCAPE is a science fiction show. It doesn't have as much science fiction in it as, say, a Star Trek TV show, but it does have wormhole technology, and the show is kind of centered around this wormhole knowledge that the main character, John Crichton, has. So it's amazing. But outside of it being a actual sci-fi show, it is heavily fantasy. It has wonderful fantasy elements to it. There's a lot to kind of unpack when it comes to the perception of like fantasy and sci-fi, and how in a larger scheme, specifically in entertainment, sci-fi shows consistently get a bad rap. They get a bad rap for being cheesy and, not being, heavily coherently plot driven. Like, you don't really have to pay attention to the plot as long as you have a bunch of weird characters in space. People will love it. And it's not very highbrow. And I think one of the few like highbrow science fiction shows is Star Trek. People respect Star Trek. It's a very respected show, even outside of the science fiction community, right? And that's because it was always took itself seriously and stayed within the realm of science fiction, but it took itself seriously. I think FARSCAPE, even though it's not as highbrow as Star Trek, and it still has those like tropes, those like cheesy sort of sci-fi fantasy tropes, which makes a true science fiction fantasy geek really happy, because those are the things that we love, regardless of the perception of it and, the wider, larger audience. We don't care, and we've never cared. That's what makes us nerds, right? So it has those tropes, it has those elements to it, but at the same time, it is a little more highbrow. It's not cheesy. The story, I mean, it can be cheesy and sometimes, but it's still fun. But the story is very coherent. The writing is amazing. The characters are great. And I just love it. I love the particularly the first 3 seasons were my favorite, right? Because I'm pretty sure that the end of season 3 is the season that Xan dies. And Xan, for me, I'm going to say, was like the downfall. All series have, that jumping of the shark, the sort of decline of the series, because everything has to come to an end, right? And even though I still watch, and enjoy the rest of season 4, and, I genuinely enjoyed the Peacekeeper Wars. I think the Peacekeeper Wars got back to those like first couple of seasons that were like really amazing. But it's kind of like after Xan died, they brought on a lot of. And the reason that Xan actually died on the show was because the actress that played her was just tired of being that character. So I guess the story was the actress that plays Xan got tired of putting on the blue makeup and like shaving her head. She had to shave her head, and she wore like extensive blue makeup. And I think she said that the blue makeup was the toxins in the blue makeup were making her sick. If you have absolutely no idea who I'm talking about, you don't know who Xan is, just a quick bio. She was a Delvian, which was a planet that was ruled by theocracy. She was a spiritual, I don't know if she was a spiritual leader. I can't remember. Paiu, I think, was a priest. She was a priest, or she was a member of the priestly class. So she was like a spiritual counselor on her home planet. So she was a spiritual counselor. She was of the priestly class on her planet. She was a Delvian from the planet Delvia. And so like her role on the show was being the mediator, and although she had a temper on her, and that's the reason that she became an outlaw, because she really essentially became like an activist on her planet, and kind of went against the government. And so she became an outlaw, and that's how she ended up with the rest of the characters on the show. Because essentially all the characters on the show are outlaws in some way. Not bad people, they just in some way were defiant towards, whoever the authority was for wherever they came from. Like Ryajo, who's my favorite character on the show, was a Dominar, which is kind of similar to Emperor of his home planet. He gets usurped, and he's on a mission to get his position back, his throne back, and in the process of that, he becomes an outlaw of his planet. And so they all have this, and then Crichton, is the American who goes through the wormhole, finds this alien place and these alien people who are outlaws as well, and he just becomes an outlaw because of being an outsider, being with these other outlaws that the peacekeepers are hunting, and the fact that he has this wormhole technology that the Peacekeepers and other multiple characters throughout the show want, right? It's very powerful, technology is very powerful knowledge that John Crichton has. So they all become, outlaws in their own way. And, Zan for me was I didn't actually understand how important Zan was as a character until she died. And I felt it. Like I cried. I think I cried the episode that she died and everyone's crying. I cried too. I was like, oh man, I'm crying because Zan died. But it was after really that she left the show that I realized how important she was to the fabric of the original cast of seasons 1 through 3, because they brought on these characters, and I think they were trying to fill that void. When shows start killing off characters, that's when you're like, okay, here's the downfall of the show, because so much of what makes the show great is the interaction between the characters and the chemistry between the characters, the original characters. And when you bring new characters on, you want that chemistry to be there. And oftentimes it doesn't with new characters. I don't know why. It's rare that, new characters come on the show and it clicks. It just clicks. And none of the characters that came on to replace Zan, and I don't want to necessarily it was a replacement of Zan, but just to kind of fill that void, and didn't do a good job of it. Like they brought on Jewel, and I remember Jewel, and I just remember being very, very irritated with that character, because if you remember, if you're a FARSCAPE person, you remember she just screamed a lot. She was pointless. She was annoying. She was whiny. Her character was meant to be that way. She was antagonistic, but she just screamed a lot in this high pitched, very annoying scream. And I kind of was like, why would a show ever put a character on where they literally just scream at a high pitch at everything? She was scared of everything, so she just screamed at everything. I think she was brought on the show to be kind of like a foil to Chiana's character on the show, but essentially the two characters were too similar. They were different, but they were just too similar to be to really stand out. Like we already had Chiana. We didn't really need another young, female character on the show who was kind of antagonistic. It was too similar. They didn't get along. The chemistry wasn't right. I really did not like Jewel at all. I really couldn't stand episodes that focused a lot on her at all. And then also with Stark was kind of the male version of Zan, and they were lovers, and he was really annoying because again, he was always, because he could see people's death or see into death or something like that. I never really paid too much attention to his character. I tried to tune him out. It was really irritating to me, and for some reason I had the impression that when Zan got killed off, that they would somehow get rid of Stark, and they didn't soon enough for me, and he was really annoying. And then it was another character that they brought on the show. It was an older woman who had the big third eye in the middle of her head, who I literally don't remember her character too much. I literally just remember her being on the show and then having the third eye. I cannot remember her purpose on the show. And it's just an example of 3 characters that were kind of meant to kind of fill that void of Zan and didn't really do a good job of it. So that 4th season was a little wonky. The chemistry between the characters was a little wonky. I still liked it because I still love the show, but the Peacekeeper Wars, the miniseries really brought everything back to the original sort of chemistry that the first 2 to 3 seasons had on the show. So, it's the characters, it is the fantasy element to it, it's the story writing, it is the science fiction that was involved in it. One of my favorite antagonist on the show was Scorpius. Scorpius was the main antagonist to Crichton for the first 2-3 seasons of the show, and he was this Scaran Sebacean hybrid, which was really unusual because those two species, they're polar opposites, and the fact that he was born to a Scaran and Sebacean, he had a lot of health problems when he was younger and barely made it, but he ended up making it and becoming a major antagonist to John Crichton because he really wanted that wormhole technology. He was obsessed with getting it. And so the thing that I really loved about Scorpius and his storyline and his plot throughout the show was the fact that eventually every antagonist has to wind down. You can't stay with the same antagonist throughout an entire show. At some point, you have to beat the antagonist or you have to move on to another antagonist, right? And because Scorpius became such a like fan favorite of the show, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, he's the antagonist, but we can't keep him as an antagonist forever because it'll get boring. But we want to keep him on the show, and so they came up with this really brilliant concept of putting a chip. It was like a chip that they put into Crichton's brain, which was Scorpius. Right? It was Scorpius. Scorpius essentially wanted that wormhole technology that Crichton kept blocking him off to. And so they put a chip in his brain. So even when he wasn't like the main antagonist on the show towards Crichton anymore, he still was an antagonist because he was internally in his brain driving him crazy. So we always got a little taste of Scorpius. He never really left. So that, and he was one of my favorite characters because again, we got the backstory of him, and he was just a fun character. He was a really, really fun character. I think the reason that Scorpius was a fun character and the reason why Aaron Soon was such an interesting character is, well, all the characters, honestly. Chiana, Zan, Scorpius, Crichton, even Crichton, like in the beginning of the series, he was very like, not one-dimensional as a character, but one-dimensional in his mission, which was to get back to Earth, to find a wormhole to get back to Earth. And then towards the latter stages of the series, he fell in love with Aaron Soon. They actually did make it back to Earth, but then he had to choose between Earth and his friends that he had been traveling with for years and became very attached to. And then all of a sudden it became this like he had to choose between getting back to Earth and the safety of his friends, and it became a conflict of interest for him. It became a question of, what do I do? And all of the characters had that within. They had this duality about them where they were struggling with something, and it was just great to watch play out on the show. And then also another thing that I loved about the show was its like space odyssey feel to it, because I think essentially shows like that just do really well in general, right? The whole space odyssey, like space cowboy theme shows like The Mandalorian, and that's essentially what Firefly was and why people loved it so much. And then this show about the outlaws traveling space, trying to get away from, the higher authority. Those shows tend to do really, really well. And that was FARSCAPE. So they just did it in outer space, and, they did it with some sci-fi and did it with a lot of fantasy. And then, of course, I don't want to forget Pilot, because some people are going to be like, oh, what about Pilot? Pilot was great. I was a super huge fan of the living ship, which I thought was a whole another complexion to the TV show, making the ship a living thing. So it couldn't just be like, hey, let's just leave the ship, or hey, let's just get the ship into fire, because that was like, it was a huge thing. It was like they could just go blast their way through everything because they had a living ship that Pilot was a part of, and they didn't want to hurt Pilot because they genuinely cared for it. So that was another element of the show that I thought was really brilliant. But essentially the writing, the costume, the characters, the science fiction, everything about that show was just entertaining. It was fun. It was just great. It was just a great sci-fi show. And again, the huge factor of the fact that it actually did incorporate some theoretical science in it, which made it a sci-fi show, not just a fantasy space odyssey show. So that's it for me. That's really all I have to say about why I loved FARSCAPE. Don't forget to comment down below why you love FARSCAPE or didn't love FARSCAPE, or what issues you might have taken with FARSCAPE. I'll accept it all, but just be respectful. And again, if you want to listen to the podcast on Spotify, which allows you, if you subscribe, you can listen to all the other podcasts that get posted early and take part in polls and things like that. The link is in the description, and I will see you guys next time.